relationship, this abusive marriage. And so it's a huge change because suddenly now I have all of this freedom that I never experienced before, and it's a little bit overwhelming. I think some days when I think, wow, I have total freedom. I don't have to answer to somebody. I don't have to walk on eggshells all day long, trying not to trigger somebody. So definitely a ton of freedom. And I've been kind of using that freedom to I really want to spread awareness about narcissism and narcissistic abuse. So, yeah, I've published a book and I have a website up and running, working on a blog, and just trying to get information out there to other victims.
So what would be something that you would tell someone who is post the breakdown of their relationship, or for a better, more positive term, that they're free now, and as you put it, right, you have all this time. Like, what's something that you'd recommend that they do immediately?
Um, for somebody who is new out of one of these relationships, is that your question?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Someone who's newly out of it and they're like, okay, Mia said that she has all this time on her hands. I have all this time on my hands. What's something that you would recommend that they do and why?
Well, I think the first thing you have to really concentrate on is your own healing, really, because especially if you've been in an abusive situation for a long time, you really have a lot to untangle from. And so, I think my first piece of advice to somebody freshly out of one of these relationships would be pay attention to yourself, for a while. It's okay to be a little selfish, right? You're healing and you really need to concentrate on self-care and just making sure that you aren't slipping into isolation, self-isolation. It's very easy to do. And then, yeah, find those things that make you happy. Find your hobbies. Find things that you enjoy because those are things you've probably had to sacrifice for the narcissist. And that can be challenging, figuring out who am I? What do I want to do? How do I want to spend my time? It can really take some time to figure that out and just reclaim who you are again.
Those are good points because you lived your life for so long, 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, in this golden cage, as you mentioned on your website, right? And then
Yes.
now you're out of the cage. Like, I remember a time, like, I wasn't in a narcissistic relationship, but I remember a time where I was in a relationship that was quite difficult. And when I left it, I felt a sense of freedom that initially I can't describe, but looking back on it, it was like, wow, I lived all that time thinking that life was okay because I got used to it. I got used to the chaos. I got used to the abuse. I got used to the just the feelings of not feeling worthy. And then when you step out of it, it makes you remember that there was a life before this person. Is that something that you kind of went through?
Yeah, definitely. I think it wasn't until I was out of it and free from it that then I could look back and say, that was a whole lot worse than I realized. Because we do, when we get into these relationships, especially if it's over a period of many years, we normalize it. And I think we do that because we all want to feel like we're normal, that we're living a quote unquote normal life. And so I think as a sort of a defense mechanism or just a coping mechanism is the word I was looking for. We try to justify it. We try to normalize it. And it's not until you get out that you look back and say, what was I thinking, But you get caught up in this trauma bonding and you you can't see it until you're finally out of it. You can't see the scope of it. And for me, that has been very eye-opening. I just it was worse than I thought it was at the time. Yeah, for sure.
What's something that surprised you when you left it? And as you mentioned the trauma bond. Like, what's something about the trauma bonding that surprised you that happened to you?
Definitely, I would have to say the way that I protected my husband's image. he is a covert narcissist. And meaning that to the outside world, he looks amazing. He is generous and kind and empathetic and just such an all-around great guy. He's not behind closed doors. It's just a mask that he's wearing out there. But the thing that surprises me the most looking back is how I protected that image and held him up. I was basically, he's out there lying to everybody basically about who he is, and I'm helping the lie. I'm promoting the lie. And rather than tell it like it is, I was saying, yeah, he's great. Everything's great. He's perfect. It's just all, we have a perfect life. And I look back and I kind of can't believe I did that. But again, part of that trauma bonding.
I spoke to a young lady and she did the same thing. And what was interesting about her situation is that she would go out of her way to protect the image. And one of the reasons why she said that is because she believed in her heart that if she let people know how bad the marriage was, or how bad maybe he was, or her, or maybe how bad she was doing, whatever the case is, just how bad overall the marriage was, she felt that if she were to ever escape that marriage, no one would want her because they would say that, well, you're one half of a bad marriage. Are those thoughts that maybe went through your mind thinking that if I eventually get the strength, the resources, the courage to leave this, would anyone ever want me because I kind of have this as part of my chapter in the book of my life?
I think with probably nearly every narcissist, they always tell their victims, no one else will have you. You're so flawed, you're so damaged. Of course, they're the ones that are flawed and damaged, but they project that on the victim. You're so flawed, you're so damaged, nobody would want to be with you. And I think as victims, we believe all these lies they tell us and all the gaslighting, and we do buy into that. I think that another thing is another reason why oftentimes we do uh, promote the lie and we don't say how bad things are is there is an element of embarrassment. There's an element of feeling like a failure. So in some cases, it's easier to just continue the lie, tell everybody things are great, and not have to face the fact of, it's very humbling to say, well, actually things aren't great. Actually it's horrible. It's embarrassing. And I think some people to save themselves that shame will continue living this crazy cycle of defending their abuser.
And that's the parts that's scary, right? Because I guess in a lot of ways, human nature, if you defend something long enough, you begin to say that, well, maybe it's not that bad as you're
Yeah,
protecting it.
definitely. Yeah, I mean, and I had convinced myself that it's not that bad. I mean, some days are really bad, but all marriages have their challenges, and this is our challenge, and it becomes your normal. You just decide and tell yourself this is how everyone lives. Of course, that's not true, and I think somewhere deep inside, I knew that wasn't true. But it was uh, the least conflicting route to go. You don't want to trigger these people. You don't want to start something. You learn early on in these relationships that it's best just to stay quiet and not bring up issues because it just creates more issues. So I think in a sense, as victims, we just, at some point, we kind of give up.
And then as part of that giving up, they may be accepting of it, right? Because now,
Definitely.
right, because they're protective of the image. Like if you look at, let's say, like a healthy relationship, you're protective of that relationship, right? Like you want to make sure that okay, I'm the buffer, I'm the barrier. Like you want to insulate your marriage when it's healthy because you're protective of it. You love this person, maybe you have children involved, and it's a whole loving and positive dynamic. But then when you have narcissistic abuse or you have narcissistic tendencies in the marriage, you could kind of have that being warped because you're not protecting the good of the relationship, you're protecting the bad of the relationship. And maybe some people don't realize it because they're in it so long that by the time it gets to the point where it's about to hit the fan, they're like, oh my goodness, it's been 5 years.
Yeah.
How did I
Yeah, that
ever miss
is.
this, right?
Yeah, you're right. You are protecting the bad. You're protecting the bad from being found out. You're hiding the bad, and it does kind of become like a full-time job, and I think another reason we do that is we do it out of fear. It seems safer to hold them up, protect their image, don't let that image ever falter, don't let that mask fall off. It's self-preservation for us. So that's just another, there's so many reasons that we are protecting this abuser. And it's so complex. And I think people on the outside don't realize how complicated this is and how many layers there are to this. And so that when you leave this relationship, and you're trying to put your life back together, it's a lot to work through. You leave, you're still trauma bonded. You don't leave and suddenly you snap your fingers and everything is fixed. Um, I went through a period of guilt. Oh, worried that I had ruined his life. Well, he had ruined his life, right? Not me. But still, I thought, I've ruined his life. What's he going to do now? This is terrible. I can't believe I've done this to him. And it's crazy why we think along those lines. But yeah, it goes back to that trauma bond. And it's not something that disappears overnight.
So let me ask you then, do you think in a way when someone is going through this type of relationship, their concept of love begins to change to fit that type of relationship?
It definitely does. Yeah, I mean, your concept of what a successful relationship looks like becomes centered around your partner. How happy is my partner? How much can I do for my partner? It becomes less and less about you and more about them when it should be an equal partnership, right? It should be about both of you. But in a narcissistic relationship, it's only about the narcissist. It's never allowed to be about the victim. And so it definitely warps your sense of what does a successful relationship look like?
And that's the problem, I think, with so many unhealthy relationships because you have people, like, even if you were to take it from, let's say, friendships to acquaintances to family to romantic relationships, when things start to go bad, I believe that, and I'll let you comment on this as well, Mia. I believe that there's a point in that relationship, whether it's a friendship, family, or romantic relationship, where you have to make a decision because you know that your body, your heart is starting to react and say that, hey, something isn't right here. But sometimes, because as we discussed, right, your concept of what is love, it has been changed, it has been altered, it has been warped in a way. So instead of going left, you just continue going down that path. And now the way you maybe looked at the relationship a few minutes before you had that decision, now the way you look at it is something totally different. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think it wasn't too long into my marriage really that I realized this really is not going the way it should. Um, and I think you kind of come to that crossroads where you say, what are my options? I was probably, I don't know how many years into my marriage I was at this point, because it took me a long time to understand that this was abuse. But it didn't take long to decide it really wasn't something wasn't right. And you do reach that crossroads and you say, what do I do? Do I leave? Because that seems like I'm giving up. That seems like I'm failing. Or do I just, plow full force ahead and try to make this work? And yeah, I mean, I definitely took the second approach and I decided to stay in it. And, these are the cards I've been dealt and I'm gonna make this work. But it was a wrong decision, but I didn't know that at the time. So yeah, you really just get you do view the relationship different when you realize there's something's not right. But again, you have two choices, stay or leave.
One woman I spoke to, this was maybe I want to say a month ago. She was in a similar situation that you described the first time, how you described now, and her and her partner, her and her husband, were very involved in the church. And one of the reasons why she stayed, to your point, to protect the image, is that she didn't want people to think differently of them because of their cultural background and their religious background, because they both were very involved in the church. They both were very active and they got married in the church. So what she did is that she decided to stay. And the longer she stayed, the abuse went from her to the daughters in the in the family that was created. And it was at that point where she decided, what example am I giving to my children? Whereas I'm taking on this abuse, but now it has spread to the daughter of the couple. And she states that the husband was actually grooming the young daughter by saying sexual things to the daughter, very abusive with the
Oh,
words and things like that. And she was so devastated because, as we discussed, right, there was a point where she said something isn't right, but because of their image and their standing and their reputation in the church, she stayed, and then it decided to pass on to her daughter. And she says that her and her daughter, after the marriage ended and the family split, had a very difficult relationship because the daughter felt unprotected by the
yeah,
mother.
definitely. Yeah, and I think that brings up a point that I've thought about a lot. It's very interesting. I wonder how much of this type of abuse happens within, the church community, that how many people feel like they can't get out because of um, because of their religious upbringing, their standards. And I mean, and I'm kind of in that same boat. Like, you're taught that you don't just walk out on a marriage. You're supposed to stay. You're supposed to make this work. And that's what our church tells us, that they're not out there preaching divorce. Of course, they're not. So I think it does make it really, really difficult for people who are involved in the church. And my husband and I were involved. That's not, I wouldn't say that's the reason why I stayed, but um, I do wonder how many people are affected and how many people stay in these marriages because of because of religious reasons. I think there's a misconception there, though. People say, I took my marriage vows and I don't want to break them. And I completely understand that. However, I think what we're not being told is, if your spouse is abusive, they've already broken those marriage vows. They're already broken. You're not breaking them by leaving, because when you take your vows to love, honor, and cherish, they're not a narcissist isn't doing any of those three things, right? So they've already broken those vows. So I think a lot of times people in the church, we're looking for permission to leave. Like, is it okay if I leave? So I do worry about that, that people get caught up in the marriage vow thing, and feel like they're not going to be accepted in the church or in society because they walked out. But those vows have already been broken.
And that's a beautiful way to put it, because once someone is damaging you emotionally, mentally, or physically, they've broken the vow, if you're looking from a religious perspective, to your
Right.
point, right? And then
Yes.
sometimes I look at these relationships and I couldn't imagine someone, like, because our childhood imprint on us is so strong in so many ways, right? And I can't imagine someone having to make a decision between, do I continue to be treated this way, or do I end this relationship even though it may not be viewed a certain type of way because of my cultural upbringing, my religious upbringing? Like, that seems like such a difficult decision to make, because it's not, you're looking, because the person who's in that situation, I'm assuming, is looking at it, do I put my personal well-being above the well-being about over people who are in a lot of ways strangers, or do I put
Right.
the the feelings of strangers above my well-being, right?
Yeah, I mean, it really can mess with your mind. I think, I grew up in the 80s, and uh, basically, society told us in the 80s that, first of all, you don't get in a marriage just to get divorced. You stick with your marriage. And the second thing that I think society told us was, abuse is physical. And so if it's not physical, yeah, it's kind of a gray area, right? And so I think a lot of my generation has that idea that you don't leave unless you're being hurt, physically injured, and you don't give up on your marriage. And you don't. Another thing that I think we're taught, or at least my generation is taught, is you don't want your kids to be children of divorce. Don't break up your family. And these rules just don't apply when you've got an abusive situation. But again, my generation, there wasn't emotional, psychological abuse. I mean, it wasn't recognized as such. So I think, yeah, it makes it really tough when you're looking at what is society going to say. But then again, does it matter what society's going to say? Like you say, these are strangers. I don't care what strangers think about me. So yeah, it just comes down to, am I going to choose myself or am I not going to choose myself?
Yeah, because that could be quite difficult, right? Like you have so many people who their reputation means so much to them that they can't allow anyone to know that my children don't go to a private school. My children
Yeah,
are
yeah,
wearing not wearing name brand. My children don't have a car, right?
right.
Like I look at it like, and maybe you've seen this. Like if you look at like let's say the corporate world, right?
Yeah,
Their image is so constructed, so designed. You throw divorce in there, it's like their entire world falls apart. Or you say that, you know what, the person I'm with, they're actually abusing me emotionally,
yeah,
mentally. To your point, right? Like some people who are of a certain generation, they're like, what are you talking about? You have a roof over your head, your kids are well fed. They
right.
can't fathom that part of it, right? But you're
Yeah.
here broken, you're here damaged, you're here unhealed, you're here crying out for help. And when you look around you, your social circle is like, you gotta suck this up because this is not something that we go through. And I couldn't imagine a situation where you're crying out for help, you're being abused, narcissist, trauma bonding, and then the people around you turn their back on you because you're ending the relationship. And then this other person in a way gets away free from it.
That's pretty much exactly how it went down for me. And yeah, my husband is, a corporate guy, wealthy, and it's all about his image. And for him, his wife leaving him, I mean, that's a scandal. And that's the last thing that he wants to happen, for his image. It's not about me, it's about how he looks. And not unlike other narcissists, he immediately launched what's known as a smear campaign, because this whole divorce, it was only about how he looked, he thought. And so the first thing on his mind was, I have to protect my image. I have to get out there and start telling everybody, who knows what he said. She's crazy. She had some mental breakdown and left me. I don't know what he said. Um, but that was his first order of business. He's got to uphold that image. Otherwise, he can't be a part of this scandal. So, yeah, he's out there day one, talking to every single person that we know jointly. I only find out because people start defriending me on Facebook. People stop talking to me, and you're thinking, well, what did I do? And then, of course, I realize, oh, okay, he's out there. But the funny thing is, and it's pretty much how narcissists work. They start that day one. And so before I even realize what's going on, he's already talked to everybody we know. So, and I joke and say, well, I didn't know it was a race. I didn't know we were in a competition here, but I didn't get the memo. And, he basically got to everybody. So yeah, that's exactly what happened. Then everybody turns their back on you because, you left. How could you do that to him? He's such a great guy. But it's all about protecting that image.
And this is why I tell people like anytime you're in an abusive situation, the first thing, the most important thing is the control over you, of course, right? Like they like
Yeah.
controlling their victims, right? The second thing is that their image is everything because if people find out who they are, they can't find another person to victimize.
That's right. That's right. So it's very important for them to they have to play the victim, in any breakup or divorce. So he's out there telling everybody horrible things that, she left me. Can you believe this? And, woe is me. And again, he's a covert narcissist. And so everybody thinks he's great. And why would they not believe him when he says he's been victimized? So yeah, it's just protect the image at all cost. It doesn't matter what he has to do, he will protect his image.
You mentioned earlier that when we first spoke, how there's certain behaviors that you demonstrated which made you a target for narcissists. And then on your website, you mentioned that how you became a prisoner in a golden cage, and you wasn't even aware that you were actually helping to build it. So what does that mean exactly to you?
Um, yeah, these narcissistic marriages, relationships, they start slow and you don't realize, you think you're coming into this. I was very naive. I was very much a people pleaser. I didn't have strong boundaries, quite frankly, because I didn't have a need for boundaries. And in my upbringing, I was always around good people. I just didn't have a need to have these strong boundaries really. And so I had weak boundaries, very much a people pleaser, very empathetic. And those are things that narcissists gravitate towards. And, I'm trying to make this marriage work. I'm trying to go along to get along. And all the while, he's manipulating me and making me feel like I'm not quite good enough. So I'm working a little bit harder to try to be better. And yeah, all the while, I'm helping build this cage, basically that he's putting me in. I'm helping him abuse me because I don't realize what he's doing. I'm giving him the benefit of the doubt. I see I was naive. I only saw the good in people. And I just didn't believe that anyone could be that insidious. So, I'm just trying to be the good wife and be everything I can. And what I'm really doing is helping him further the abuse. And just, not knowing.
So many victims don't even realize they're building their own prison within their relationship.
You don't. And really for me, it by the time that I did figure it out, I was so ingrained in this relationship that it's like, well, I've been here for this many years and I have two kids and I can't get out now. I mean, there's just no path forward for me. So you find yourself in this prison and you think then you try to figure out how did I get here? Like what is it that I did to put myself here and to allow myself? That was I was very angry with myself. How did I allow myself to be put in here? Because I wasn't fighting it. I was allowing it. And that gets into we've got to forgive ourselves, really. And it's hard.
When you ask that question, out of like once you realize what was going on and you became upset with yourself and you started asking yourself questions like, how did I get here? How did I allow this? How did that make you feel then versus how it makes you feel now?
I think then it made me angry, but I just felt defeated, and I knew the answer. How did I get here? I knew the answer. I never would put my foot down. I never would take a stand. I caved into him every single time. And, he was very manipulative. If he needed me to cave, he knew that the card he could play is, well, I'm just going to hurt myself and he knew every time I would give in. Okay, whatever it is that I need to do, I'll do because I don't want I don't want that to be on me. Um, and so I knew how I got there. I just I intentionally allowed it. I didn't put my foot down. I didn't take a stand. I had zero boundaries. So yeah, I was angry, but at the time I felt defeated. Now I look back and say, well, I just didn't have the tools that I needed going into this marriage. I did not have the life experience. And like I say, I came from a place of just being very naive, kind of living in a bubble and I just I didn't know what I didn't know. So I never had bad intentions. I just I didn't know any better, really.
And I asked that question because I had a similar thought. And like you, I became upset and frustrated with myself because I had a certain view of who I was at that point in time, right? And then when I went through a difficult relationship where I was being emotionally and verbally abused, one thing that came into my mind, one thought, was that how can I, Terrain, be going through something like this? And then I began to realize that being taken advantage of, abused in this fashion, it doesn't base it off of skin color or sexual orientation, your religious background, culture, your gender, nothing. It's strictly the behaviors that you give off. A lot of people maybe aren't as secure in certain areas of their life, and then the abusers, they know how to exploit that, how to pick on that. Many women will tell you that when they go through it, is that the narcissist told them everything that they wanted to hear because there was maybe a point in life where they didn't want to hear it. And a lot of men will say that, well, she made me feel this way. She looked at this way, or I didn't ever think a woman of this beauty would ever be interested in me. So it's interesting to see how people have a certain image of themselves, how they could never be a victim of abuse, they can never be a victim of a robbery until it actually happens, and they take a step back and they're like, okay, I see why this has happened. Was that like an aha moment for you as well?
Yeah, yeah, it was. And I think you're right. Abuse knows no limits, right? It's not I mean, it can happen to anybody. And I think it's easy to say, well, I would never allow that. People on the outside can look in and say, well, I would never have allowed anyone to treat me like that. Well, but you don't know because you don't know how that relationship began and how these people can manipulate you, and before you know it you're sucked in. So it's easy to say, oh, I could never be in that kind of relationship. I would leave the minute that, the first mean thing they said, I would be out the door. Well, I mean, maybe, but maybe not. It depends on, your personality traits. And like myself, I was such a people pleaser that, that just wasn't on my agenda. But yeah, you just don't know. And the other thing, to that point, you can't judge, based on someone's financial situation, or, how they live, their lifestyle, whether or not there could be abuse in that home. I mean, you never know. You really never know.
So now that you have looked to rebuild your life and things have changed and you're on the upswing, as I like to call it, you recently wrote a memoir, I believe, right, called Bridemaid. Can you speak about that?
Yeah, so when I left, when I got divorced, I was really wanting to learn a lot about narcissism, narcissistic personality disorder. It was so amazing to me that I figured out this is what was going on, every box checked, and I just wanted to learn more about this. How do people end up narcissists? And I was reading so much about it, but everything I found was either written by a therapist or a psychologist. And I really wanted to hear like an insider point of view. Like what did somebody else who's been through this, what did their life look like day to day? I couldn't find that. And so that's why I decided maybe a memoir would be helpful, because maybe there's other people out there that are saying, well, what does that look like? What is day-to-day life with a narcissist like? How does that play out? And yeah, so the book begins right when I meet my now ex-husband, and it goes all the way through my divorce. So you can just kind of see the progression of how this all played out, and how I got into it and how I got out of it. So yeah, I hope that other victims out there can find some validation when they read it.
How did it feel for you to put your experiences and your life into this book in hopes of it helping others?
It was definitely scary. I I wasn't I had a hard time opening up, really. And it wasn't as easy as I thought it was going to be. But at the same time, I did not find it re-traumatizing or anything like that. Quite to the contrary, I found it very therapeutic. It kind of felt like once I recounted all of these stories, got them out of my head, put them on paper, I almost felt like I could let go of them. So the whole process, I think, of writing was very freeing. And I definitely, some people ask, isn't that traumatizing to relive those instances and have to tell all these things? And really, no. It to me, it was freeing and very, very therapeutic.
That's a question I think a lot of people ask because maybe they're thinking if it happened to me, I would never get over it or it'll be long lasting. But you realize human beings, like people in general, are a lot stronger than maybe we give them credit for and very resilient, I would say, right? Like we're very good at rebuilding. And I'm glad that you're able to answer that way because sometimes some people, they'll kind of tiptoe around you. They're like, okay, you know what? I don't want to trigger you. I don't want to
Yes.
re-traumatize you, right? Like, did you
Yeah.
experience that as well?
Yeah, definitely. People don't want to ask too many questions, or, I have a couple of friends that will avoid the topic altogether. Like they just pretend like I'm not divorced. Oh, we don't want to talk about that. And my response to that, actually, I find that offensive. I really do, because it makes me feel like they think I should be embarrassed by it. That it's an embarrassing thing that I got divorced. And I finally spoke up, and I told somebody when they were kind of tiptoeing around it, and I said, I'm not embarrassed by the fact that I left my husband. I mean, this doesn't have to be like a taboo subject. Um, it's not embarrassing, and I don't like for other people to think that, maybe I'm embarrassed by it. That's ridiculous. So yeah, I definitely people tiptoe around it, and I'm sure they mean no harm, but it's a little bit offensive to me.
Yeah, it's like you're walking around with the mark of Cain, where there's this
Yeah.
identifying mark, and people think that they're just going to treat you like some kind of leper, but
Yes.
it's you coming out of a difficult situation. And I'm glad you mentioned that because it's interesting how the perception of certain things for certain people are like some people, no matter the reason, they look at divorce as you have somehow failed in life regardless of the
Yes.
reason why you divorce, right? Whereas some other people look at, oh, you're married, regardless of how healthy the marriage is, they'll view you a certain way. It's like it's interesting to see the different dynamic, and I'm glad that you're able to explain it and stand up for it. Like, is that how you were seeing it as well?
Um, I'm not really sure. I think I mean I guess to a degree, when we're married and we see people that get divorced, I mean, I hate to think that I would think they failed, but that their marriage failed, right? Because you never know what's going on behind the scenes. But I think a lot of people do see it that way. They do see, if you're married, you've succeeded. If you stay married, you succeed. If you divorce, you fail. But it's not, yeah, it doesn't work that way. I mean, you could have a very unhealthy, very toxic marriage. I don't call that succeeding. And you could leave a toxic marriage, and I don't call that failing. I mean, it's really the reverse, right? So yeah, I mean, you can't be so quick to judge and say, well, they've been married for 40 years. What a success story. I hope it's a success story. But you can't assume that.
Yeah, like it goes back to the question, who's more courageous, who's more healthy? The person that leaves a bad situation or the person that stays in it?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting point. Yeah, who is more courageous, the one that leaves or the one that stays? Yeah.
So
Interesting.
as we close, Mia, what's next for you and what do you want to share with our audience that you have coming up?
Um, I don't I don't really know. I've got this website launched now. I'm hoping to get a little more um, frequent with my blogs. So I'm working on that. Um, and just right now, just promoting my book, doing a lot of speaking engagements, and I'm finding that, I feel that's very worthwhile. I'm spreading the message about narcissism, and honestly, that's keeping me pretty busy right now. So